Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Audrey and here I like to talk about all things slow living, beauty, a little bit of reading, all kinds of fun stuff. So thank you for joining me today. Today I will be covering the books that I read in the month of June. June was a super good reading month for me. I read 15 books despite having a crazy month and being sick for a long time. And let's go ahead and share some of the things that I read. I will separate things by genre. Let's go ahead and start off with fantasy. So one of my favorite books that I read this month was The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This book is such an interesting premise because it basically follows the story of a social worker who essentially works for magical CPS. He's tasked with inspecting different orphanages that hold magical children. It's basically just about as whimsical as it sounds. He gets assigned to this orphanage that is next level dangerous compared to the rest of the orphanages. The children are deemed different. Despite being very whimsical and lighthearted, there are some deeper themes in this book: prejudice and acceptance. Ultimately, this was just a super fun read that was so wholesome and heartwarming that I actually teared up at one point, so that was fun. That doesn't normally happen with me, so this one really got to me. When I read a book that I never want to end, I read it very slowly. I read this book very, very slowly. I have never felt like I was watching an animated movie before when I was reading a book. This book felt like an animated movie. It was so punchy and funny, and the pacing was just like that of an animated movie, which I love. It was so immersive and just sucked me right in. I literally read the last third in one sitting because I was just so invested. The characters are so lovable and delightful, and actually the kids in this book are written like kids. They act and talk like kids, which is always refreshing. The pacing was great. I just was so happy while reading this. I was so charmed by all of the characters that I was just happy. Wherever this book took me, I was happy in all the corners that it took me in because I was just having such a good time. I do have my criticisms of this book, but I don't know how much I can go into detail without spoiling things. Mostly, I just feel like the mysteries of this book could have been drawn out a little bit more. I found the twists were predictable, but that's not really what this book is about. I felt like there were moments where some of the subplots were losing traction. But this is a book that really features characters more than plot, and I found myself just really, really loving that aspect of this story. I gave this one 5 stars. I really enjoyed my time here. Alright, more fantasy. I read the Celestial Kingdom duology by Sue Tan. I read Daughter of the Moon Goddess, the first book in the duology, for my fantasy book club. This duology is based on Chinese mythology. It follows the story of a woman and their daughter who are imprisoned on the moon for stealing an elixir of immortality. Our main character is fighting against the Society of Immortals to basically prove her place in the world and free her mother from her imprisonment on the moon. This book is not something that is like anything else I've read before. I tend to avoid young adult fiction because I don't find it very relatable or entertaining anymore, just for me and where I am in life right now. But this one really gripped me. This isn't marketed as YA, but I would definitely call this YA just from the feeling. There's romance, but there's no spice. It's just like very wholesome. You know, very like family friendly, doesn't get too dark. Has danger, has the action, but it doesn't get too dark. It's very YA. But I had a great time. I really enjoyed the imagery that Tan uses in her books. It just feels so lush and vivid and immersive. Her descriptions are very powerful, and she uses like metaphors a lot to just like weave this image that is so beautiful and enchanting. And I felt like watching this world of immortals unravel in front of me was so exciting. I just was enchanted by the imagery in this book. And the romance was so exciting and interesting. It was a subplot, which I really enjoy that about a book with a lot of action in it. It kept the romance to a subplot level, which was super fun and felt appropriate, and I was hooked on this book. I've had so much fun. I'm so glad that this was our first book club read together. I gave this one 5 stars too. I don't just give everything 5 stars, but there were some really good books this month. I will talk about the sequel a little bit too. I won't talk about the premise too much because that would spoil the events in the first book, but basically my feelings about this sequel, I felt like I'm glad I read it, but I didn't feel like it was entirely necessary because the first book really concludes in a place that is there are still like some loose ends, but I didn't feel like I needed an entire almost 500-page book. This book is jam-packed full of so much action and really concludes the story in a satisfying way, but it didn't leave me off feeling the same. Like, I was so happy after the first book. This disrupted some of the feelings of happiness that I had after the first book. Things get a little bit more complicated, things get a little bit more real. Some of the magic was a little bit lost on me, and that was something that I really enjoyed about the first book, was kind of how like beautiful and perfect everything was. Even though there was darkness in this world, everything felt like it was so intentional and still had its beauty and charm. This book got a little bit more complicated and dark, and I wasn't sure how much I liked that after how much I loved leaving the first book off, so that's what I'll say about this one. I still had a good time reading this. I'm glad that I did, but you definitely don't need to read both of them to be able to have a wonderful reading experience reading the first book in the duology. I still gave this one 4 stars because I had a good time. Up next is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. This was my first Gaiman actually, which is so crazy, but yeah. This story is like another young adult fantasy. This one is a classic, so I won't waste too much time talking about the premise, but basically our hero is a young man who's trying to win the heart of his beloved and goes on this quest to retrieve an object to win her affections. So it's very like quest, romance, adventure type thing that I just eat up. I read this in one day. I devoured this. This just read so smooth. It read just like butter. It was so exciting. It was so enchanting. I actually watched the movie. I think it came out in like 2006 or 2007, but I watched the movie of this as a kid. I thought it was super fun, and honestly, the book just blows it out of the water to the point where I actually rewatched the movie the day I read this, and it just made me not enjoy the movie anymore because of how much fun I had reading this book. Gaiman just writes so, he just has such a on-point sense of humor, and the pacing was so like fast-paced and snappy that like that's how I was able to read this in one freaking day. I know it's not a long book, it's like under 300 pages, but still, like, that was all I did that day, was read this book, and it was a good day. So I gave this one 5 stars just because how much fun this was. Like, it was perfect. It was a perfect, like, fun, adventurous fantasy quest. Like, if that's what you need in your life, read Stardust by Neil Gaiman, please. You will thank yourself. Up next is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is the author's debut novel, and it is a story of high fantasy and low stakes. This is another hot girl novel that everybody's read, so I won't waste too much time talking about it, but basically, our protagonist, Viv, is an orc who retires from adventuring to open up a coffee shop, and if that isn't the most adorable premise, then I don't know what to tell you. Like, sorry. But this book really just felt like a warm hug. It was so... like, Baldree is so funny, and he just knows what he's doing. Baldree is actually an audiobook voice actor, so I can kind of feel like I was able to... like, this felt like a storybook that somebody was reading to me. It was just so funny. It was so personable. The characters in here were so adorable. I actually almost cried from how cute the little rat character was. Thimble. His name is Thimble. There's a little rat character in here named Thimble, and he bakes. He makes little cinnamon rolls and chocolate croissants, except he calls them midnight crescents. Read this book. I had a really good time reading this. It wasn't like, it is a cozy fantasy, so don't come in here expecting like, you know, a crazy adventure, a whole lot of plot. That being said, this was a little bit higher stakes than I was expecting based on just what I had heard about this book. That you're still invested in the story, you're invested in the characters, you're invested in the outcome of the plot. And things do get a little bit intense at one point, so even though it's set in like kind of this fantasy D&D world, you're not fighting and battling monsters, like you're still very invested in the danger of this story. So that was something that I thought was super cool. I actually gave this one 5 stars. I didn't give everything this month 5 stars. Just wait, okay? Just trust me. Alright, up next is Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I read the audiobook for this, so I don't have a physical copy with me. But basically, this is a telling of Norse mythology. Gaiman puts his own spin on things, but it stays very true to the essence of the characters and stories and personalities. I have never read a book that was so easy to read. Like, it felt like a children's storybook despite being like actually very highly informative and interesting and gripping, and yeah, it was just such a good time. It was funny, it was informative, I learned a whole lot. It was very fast-paced and snappy, so I appreciated that. And if you do read the audiobook, Neil Gaiman actually narrates his own books, and he is an excellent narrator. He has the best voice ever, so I'm definitely interested in reading more of his audiobooks. I had a great time here. I gave it 5 stars. You can tell that fantasy is very like I'm a big fantasy fan, if you can't tell by my background, so I have a good time. So the next book I read was actually The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, this being the second part of The Lord of the Rings. This one took me a long time to get through. Obviously, it's The Lord of the Rings. It's not known for being an easy read, but I was just so enchanted. This is actually my first time reading Lord of the Rings. I have never read the series before. I've read The Hobbit a million times, but never actually read the books, so I'm culturing myself. My little goldfish brain really struggles with these. I find myself having to reread and reread paragraphs from time to time, so I can't necessarily say that I had the best time of my life reading these. But that being said, obviously there were a whole bunch of passages and characters and descriptions that really stuck with me. Can we just talk about Ents for a second? I love Ents so much. They are so funny and charming and whimsical, and I just would spend all my time with them if I could. My favorite character is Quickbeam, which, by the way, Ents are a magical race of tree creatures, sentient tree creatures, who are very powerful but also very peaceful. Treebeard and Quickbeam were just so funny and charming and lovable, and I just want to live in a forest and not go to work and just talk to trees all day. So thank you, Two Towers, for letting me live out that fantasy for a little bit. I typically don't rate classics because, like, what does my little pea brain have to say compared to, like, the father of modern fantasy? But let me just say that this was beautifully crafted, so excellent. I've been spoiled a little bit by my modern fast-paced writers, and it was a little bit hard to get into at times. Despite having read 15 books this month, this book took me 8 days, so just let that sink in. I'll let you do the math. There we go. Well, that's all the fantasy I read this month. Let's talk about my contemporary fiction that I read. Dogs of Summer by Andrina Abreu. Oh man, this book was a ride. Read this book as part of Allison Page's book club. She's my favorite book talk creator, and I love her, so I strongly recommend joining her Patreon if you're looking for a fun if you're looking for a fun group of people. But anyways, with that being said, I would have not normally picked this book up if it weren't for that. I was really struck by this book. This book follows the story of two young best friends, 10-year-olds who live in the Canary Islands, low social economic status, dealing with things like tourism and classism. The focus of this story is on this friendship between our main character, our unnamed main character, and her best friend Isora. It borders the line on obsession. It definitely is erotic, and it was very disturbing and hard to read at times. And it's hard for me to say what this book is beyond that, because it's very literary and character driven. Not a whole lot happens, but we're able to kind of see their relationship and how both of the characters are so strongly pushed and pulled by each other. It's really fascinating. I feel like it's a very grotesque but kind of accurate depiction of girlhood and how gross and real that can be. So I was able to really enjoy that. It was also really exciting to see the feelings of a young queer person who didn't have the language to express themselves or their feelings. That was done in a very interesting and new way that I've never seen a book do before. There's a part where the main character talks about wanting to eat her best friend and poop her out so she can keep her in a poop box and just carry her with her all the time. So very 10-year-old obsession, best friend. Am I in love with you or you're my best friend? But I don't have the words to tell you that. I don't understand how this is supposed to look. Yeah, this book definitely isn't for everybody. I definitely found myself going back and forth on it, but I think I'm definitely able to see the value. And even though this was a book that was hard to read and was confusing and kind of disturbing, I'm still able to see the value in a story like that, so I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Alright, up next is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. This was my first Murata, and I had a really good time here. This follows the story of a Japanese woman who works at a convenience store. She's kind of teetering on the age where she's kind of past. Most of her friends and family have been married by now, and people are starting to get a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that she hasn't really moved on in life from working at her part-time job. It isn't like a real job. It isn't considered a valuable place in society. Our main character is neurodivergent. She struggles socially. She struggles with fitting in and finding people who accept her for who she is. So this is really her quest to find that and balancing society's needs with her own needs. As a neurodivergent person, those needs are going to be different from most people's. So this is a really good illustration of how that looks. I had a great time with this book. As low stakes as it kind of sounds, I was actually incredibly stressed out by how this book was gonna end, but I feel like it resolved in a way that really worked out. I read the audiobook for it. It's narrated by Nancy Wu, and she did a fantastic job. I would absolutely look for more things from her, just because I think she was such a good narrator. She was amazing. But yeah, this book was funny, it was personable, it was sweet, it was real, it was important. I gave this one 4 stars. I had a great time here. Up next is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. Just like Convenience Store Woman, this book features a neurodivergent protagonist. In this case, he is I believe, 15-year-old boy who is solving a murder. Not the murder of a person though, it's the murder of a dog. And he uncovers all kinds of things that he isn't expecting about his community and even his own family. The message of this story is really kind of that, you know, people really look down on the protagonist, Christopher, for being neurodivergent. He is autistic and struggles socially, has meltdowns, has outbursts, and the adults in his life who are neurotypical don't really have a lot of patience or empathy for him. And the message of this story is really kind of that they're neurodivergent adults who are supposed to be the responsible or the good ones are actually capable of so much more terrible things than our kind of demonized protagonist ever could be. At least that was what I got out of this book. One thing I will say about this story, don't be like me and do not read the audiobook. I probably would have rated this higher if I didn't read the audiobook. This is a first-person story, so Christopher is telling the story from his own accounts. We hear like very long descriptions and lists about things that have nothing to do with the story, but that our protagonist is very interested in, so it got kind of bothersome to hear these lists read out to me, where if I was reading, I could have just like absorbed it right away. I wouldn't need to like have it drawn out for such a long time. So I cannot recommend the audiobook. I really felt like this reading experience would have been much better if I had a physical copy, but I will say I still really enjoyed this story. I feel like it has a very valuable message. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Alright, my last fiction book I read this month is Snot Girl Volume 1. This is a classic graphic novel about a social media star named Lottie, and she has a perfect life where full of parties and wealth and never having to worry about anybody but herself. And things go wrong very, very fast. I don't know how much I want to say because I feel like this one has a lot of shock factor, but yeah, the art in this one is beautiful. It's just it's so gorgeous. I've been following the artist Leslie Hung actually for a long time, and yeah, I've just always been enchanted by her art style. I had a wonderful time here. This one is a little bit more of a slow burn, but honestly, like, by how beautiful the art style is, I felt like I was just like, it was a pleasure to read this one. I did end up giving this one 4 stars though instead of 5 because I do feel like it could have been streamlined a tiny bit, but I still had a really good time and I'd be really interested in reading the 2nd and 3rd volumes. So yeah, we'll definitely be picking those up whenever I see them in my local half-price books. Alright, well that's all the fiction I read this month. I have 4 nonfiction books to talk about. Let's start off with the worst of the worst. The Nature Fix by Florence Williams. I was so excited for this book. It sounded like it was going to be so interesting, but basically this book is the author's attempts to convince us about the importance of nature, spending time in it, understanding it, and the many benefits that has for our physical and mental health. Very strong premise. I was very interested and very convinced just by the premise alone. I found this book to be really disappointing. It was long-winded, it was disorganized. I feel like this book couldn't make up its mind about what it wanted to be. Like, it was cross between a memoir, an informative text on neuroscience, a collection of inspiring Pinterest quotes. I felt like it had no idea what it wanted to be. It dips its toes into all of these formats, jumping back and forth, but it doesn't really go very deep into any of them. So the result is kind of like this blurry and chaotic snapshot of shallow descriptions, fun facts, and inspiring quotes. There are a bunch of different characters introduced in the story, but we don't really spend any time with them. And when I say characters, I mean like real life researchers that the author spends time with, even in the author's own family, but we don't like get to know any of them on a personal level. But like, we hear descriptions about what their hair looks like, we hear descriptions of the food that they're eating, and like, it just feels like it wants to be a memoir, but it doesn't like spend it doesn't spend any time establishing roots into the time and place that the author is, so it just is really disorganized and chaotic. I think that nonfiction tying its roots into real life examples can be really powerful. I think some positive examples of that are Body Keeps the Score and Atomic Habits, The Miracle of Mindfulness. 2 of those I read this month and I loved, and this book casts its net wide instead of deep. We don't scratch the surface of anything. The worst thing I can say about this book was the audiobook narrator. She literally read the book sounding like an old Navy back to school commercial. She even gave silly voices to the scientists. Like, she read quotes of, for example, if there was a Japanese neuroscientist, she would read the quote from the Japanese neuroscience, trying to sound like a wise old Japanese man. It just was very silly and inappropriate, and I did not like it. Took me out of the story. Like my reading experience was miserable. I hated it. I feel like I forced myself to read this just so that I could leave a bad review and spite it. Other thing that I really hated about this book, and I'll keep it quick because I've been going on for a long time, but there's so many things actually. There's a lot of concerning opinions in this book actually. Like the author says that she throws kind of unexplained statistics out about how schizophrenia is higher in the cities because they don't have access to nature, and autism is more common in city locations because they don't have access to nature. And I'm like, dog, do you think that people have autism because they don't go outside? Like, is that the point you're trying to make? Just make your own conclusion from there. So yeah, I give this one 1 star. It was truly abysmal. Next up is Atomic Habits, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. This is a nonfiction self-help about building better habits in your lives. It's basically cognitive behavioral therapy, but from a businessman's perspective. This book was really great. It helped me build some really powerful changes in my life, like going to the gym and cleaning my room and just like little things like that, because it kind of took the pressure off of inviting change into my life, and I really appreciated that. Something I did not love about this book is that you could really tell that the author was like a businessman slash athlete, kind of jockey bro dude type person. Don't get me wrong, he's very intelligent and he made some very good points, but I just feel like his delivery was a little bit one note, and as a kind of like more artistic woman, like, I don't know, not really in those worlds, I kind of just was like bored, and some of his examples were kind of annoying to me. I also feel like there's a good deal of fat phobia in this book just because like the only time that weight or exercise is discussed in this book is to talk about how you must want to lose weight and how that is a good thing for everybody, and how being overweight is a bad thing for everybody, and how everybody must want this goal for themselves, which I think is just, it's a common culture's perspective. So it's not like, you know, it's not like I haven't heard that opinion before, but I do think that it is problematic and should be called out. But overall though, I feel like this book had some really good advice and some really good takes. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Alright, I also read 2 books by Thich Nhat Hanh this month, the first of them being The Miracle of Mindfulness, as well as Peace Every Step. I have the physical copy for The Miracle of Mindfulness, and The Peace of Every Step I read as an audiobook. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist monk who is most famous for advocating for peace in America during the Vietnam War. Very influential in spreading mindfulness to American thinking, which mindfulness is essentially living with intention and awareness and acceptance for life in the present moment, no matter what it throws at you. As somebody who works in the mental health space, this is an invaluable resource for me. I truly feel so transformed by incorporating mindfulness in my life. Even just something simple as body awareness and breath awareness can really transform the way you view the world around you, and just foster such a powerful sense of peace and acceptance and gratitude. So really, really powerful and profound stuff here. But Thich Nhat Hanh really makes it so accessible in his like 200-page, super easy and beautifully written books. I'm not talking about them separately just because I feel like they were so similar, and there was a lot of repetition between Peace Every Step and The Miracle of Mindfulness. Miracle of Mindfulness was written in 1975. Peace Every Step was written in 1990. I feel like Peace is Every Step was a little bit more succinct and streamlined, probably because he had another like 15 years to perfect his message and get it across. So I would recommend Pieces Every Step ahead of The Miracle of Mindfulness. The Miracle of Mindfulness had about 50 pages or so, basically just about Buddhist principles, which I thought were really interesting, but I was not here to learn about Buddhism specifically, so that kind of slowed me down a little bit. But it was interesting and helpful. But I don't know, I honestly could have done without it because it just wasn't what I was preparing myself to read, and it was kind of dense and hard to get through. I didn't read like the way a book would read. But yeah, this was really profound. It covers things like death anxiety, acceptance of all things in life. I'm gonna read a quote that I liked. By overcoming revulsion and fear, life will be seen as infinitely precious, every second of it worth living. And it is not just our own lives that are recognized as precious, but the lives of every other person, every other being, every other reality. Life and death are but two faces of life, and that without both, life is not possible, just as two sides of a coin are needed for the coin to exist. So beautiful. Yeah, I was so touched by Thich Nhat Hanh's message, and I strongly recommend his books for anybody, regardless of who you are, whether you're in therapy or not, whether or not you are interested in Buddhism or mindfulness or spirituality. Read his books, foster a sense of appreciation and wonder for life, and just be transformed. That's all I can say. I gave The Miracle of Mindfulness 3 stars, and I gave Pieces Every Step 5 stars. Well, that's everything I read in the month of June. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts about these books, if you read anything of your own this month. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm trying to upload a new video every Sunday, so feel free to subscribe if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!